Good morning.
Good morning. Well, it's good to see all of you today. Boom. Boom. Mayor Mike says boom. So we're going to start out with a prayer and a pledge today, but it's great to see all of you here in Newcastle bright and early in the morning. And especially Harriet, she's been traveling all over the state and hasn't even been home yet for several weeks. And so we're so fortunate to have her representing us in Washington, D.C. So please join me as we pray this morning, if you'd like to stand, if you're able. Father God, we thank you so much for this wonderful nation that you have given us to live in. And we thank you that you have brought us here for such a time as this, to defend our liberty and to protect our children and to see our nation come back to thriving again. We pray that you would turn every heart back to you and that you would bring this nation back to its knees before you, that we would be a country that would honor you and give you glory in the earth and spread the good news of Jesus Christ. We thank you for our Representative Harriet. We ask you to continue to bless her, give her favor, strength, and fortitude as she represents the state of Wyoming. We pray that you will hover over this election, that you will raise up the leaders that you have called to lead this state, that we will stand in the gap in Wyoming and lead this country back to energy dominance. Father God, we ask you to bless our state with godly leaders, and we pray these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Thank you. Sherry, you're going to have to start traveling with me. That was a beautiful prayer, and what a wonderful way to start the day on a beautiful day. Absolutely stunning out there. Sherry's right. I haven't actually made it to my physical home, but I kind of consider all of Wyoming my home, so it's great to be back here. We've been traveling extensively over the last several weeks, trying to get to all of the corners, pretty much as many counties as we can in as quick a time as possible. One of the things that I did when I ran for this office was I talked a lot about accountability and being accountable to the people who elect you and actually being accountable to do the things that you said you would do. I think it's one of the biggest frustrations I hear is that people say, I voted for you because you said you were going to be X, Y, and Z, or that you were going to do A, B, and C, and then you get back there and you don't do it. Either you get back to Washington, D.C., or you get to Cheyenne and you don't vote or you don't do the things that you said that you would do. And I think accountability right now is one of the most important things that we have, that we need to be holding our leaders accountable. They oftentimes speak one way and talk about being conservative, and then they vote another way. And part of the way that I want to be held accountable, and I said what I would do when I ran for office, is that I would come back to every county every year and do a town hall. And I travel a lot around the state when I'm here. I'm not always doing town halls. I'm touring businesses. I'm meeting with local leaders. I'm bringing in other congressmen and women to Wyoming so that they can experience my state. In fact, several weeks ago, well, gosh, now time flies so fast. Probably 2 months ago now, we brought in people. The chairman of the Public Lands Subcommittee, Mineral Subcommittee, we brought him here into northeastern Wyoming. So we toured a uranium mine, I took him to the coal mines, we had meetings with the public and things. So they weren't necessarily town halls, but I thought it was important for him in his role. He's from Minnesota, he's from northern Minnesota, and they have a lot of resources up there, a lot of mining resources up there. Thought it was important for him to see what we do here and what we're producing. And I've done that a couple of times, bringing people into Wyoming. But that aside, town halls are different. Town halls are where I can come here, I can give you an update on what I've been doing recently, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. I want to have this as a dialogue. I want to engage with you on the issues that are important to you. And that's why I think that town halls are very special. And I think that, we ought to be holding all of our elected officials to coming back here, coming to us and answering for the decisions that they make, the votes they take, the positions that what it is that they're doing in their elected offices. So again, I'm just going to give you a quick overview. We're going to open this up for questions. We'll have a dialogue on what's important to you. Again, thank you for turning out. I'm always kind of surprised at the number of people who will come to these, and I'm very pleasantly surprised. And what that tells me is people are incredibly engaged right now. They really want to know what's going on. They recognize that the decisions coming out of Washington, D.C., for better or worse, are having a huge impact on their lives. And so thank you for being here this morning. The House was in session for 9 weeks over the course of May, June, and July. And after completing the final two sessions, the final two session weeks in July, the House is now in our August recess. This gives us an opportunity to come home, be with our constituents, travel the states for me, or for those folks to travel their districts and talk to the people, specifically before the upcoming November election. There's a lot going on out there. This summer, the House turned to fiscal year 25 appropriations bills, and we passed 5 of the 12 appropriation bills prior to our recess. The Senate has not passed any. One of the things that I have learned about Washington, D.C. is while I think we ought to be in regular order and we ought to pass our appropriations bills so that we know what we're going to spend and on what and why, there's a lot of politicians who have figured out that if we do continuing resolutions and omnibus spending bills, we're just continuing to ratchet up spending in Washington, D.C. I kind of see that here in Wyoming, too. The budget this last year for Wyoming was the largest budget in state history, and we need to be paying a lot more attention to that. You know, we don't need to expand government. I just really don't believe we need to be expanding government. We need to be constraining it. And so we've got as I said, 5 of the 12 bills, the Senate hasn't taken them up. I imagine when we return in September, we're going to have to deal with a continuing resolution. I have so far voted against all of those. I have voted against all omnibus spending bills. They've passed without me because the Democrats and Republicans get together and they will do that. They will pass those. But we're $35 trillion in debt. And at some point, somebody's going to have to figure this out. Somebody's going to have to figure out that we're going to cut spending. But there is one appropriations bill that came out in July that was passed by the House that I'm actually very proud of. For one thing, when we, the Republican-controlled House, are doing appropriations bills, we're cutting spending. We're cutting spending and we're getting rid of things like the DEI nonsense. So when we do these bills, we typically are taking out and cutting all diversity, equity, inclusion offices. We're cutting all of the funding for that kind of nonsense. So the bills that we are passing are actually conservative bills. But one that I'm very proud of is the appropriation bill, HR 8998, and it funds the Department of Interior and EPA. Well, obviously, those are 2 agencies that have huge impacts on the state of Wyoming. But why I'm proud of those bills is, number one, we cut spending for both of those agencies. But I got some very important provisions in those bills for the state of Wyoming. I think that probably of any state, we got more out of this appropriations bill than pretty much any other state. First of all, the base text of the bill includes the Grizzly Bear State Management Act, which will delist the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem grizzly bear. And we've been fighting that for a long, long time. The grizzly bear was listed as threatened in 1975. They have been recovered for over 2 decades. The recovery numbers were 500 bears. We have over 1,100 bears. Fish and Wildlife Service will tell you that Yellowstone National Park is entirely saturated, and they're now seeing bears as far south as Rock Springs. We're seeing that what they're doing to our other wildlife, to our livestock industry, and also just in the fact that they're very dangerous predators. Now, we've got a recovered species, and we ought to delist them. The state of Wyoming petitioned to delist a couple of years ago. The Fish and Wildlife Service was supposed to respond within 12 months. They have failed to do that, and I've continued to try to hold them accountable. We had a gentleman in front of our subcommittee, our Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries subcommittee, of which I'm a member, a couple of weeks ago, and I went after him about the grizzly bear. And you may notice if you've ever seen any of our videos, these people try to avoid every way they can to answering a question. It's kind of like pulling teeth. And so you always have to think, how do I answer the question so they can't avoid answering it? So instead of just saying, is the grizzly bear recovered, which he would give me a lot of mealy-mouthed nonsense, I said, if in 1975 we have the numbers that we do today, would they ever have been listed in the first place? And he said, no, they would not. And I said, then they're recovered and they need to be delisted. And he said, well, you'll be happy to know that by the end of July, we will be issuing a decision. And I'm like, cool, he just gave me a really good answer. I think that hopefully they're gonna propose delisting at the end of July. Well, at the end of July, they sent a letter saying they need another 6 months. That's Washington. That is Washington, D.C. So we continue to push them that, but delisting is in the bill, which would take it out of the hands of the Fish and Wildlife Service entirely. The amendments that I got passed on the floor of the House, one would block the funding for the Rock Springs BLM, the BLM office, Rock Spring office of the RMP. So we're trying to defund their effort to implement that horrific RMP that they issued last September. So that's one of the amendments I got through on the floor. The other, another amendment we got through on the floor will be to defund the Buffalo BLM office RMP that would stop us from doing any coal mining in the Powder River Basin. So I'm attempting to defund their ability to do that as well. And that is obviously an extremely important one in light of the fact that we all like electricity. You know, maybe the folks back in DC don't understand where it comes from, but we do. Coal is the energy of the future, and we as Wyoming have got to be pushing back against the nonsense of global warming and climate change and it being an existential threat. That's all nonsense. It's a hoax. We got to start pushing back as a state of Wyoming and saying we're not going down this road. The people of this country are entitled to affordable and reliable energy. They just are. We're entitled to, these resources belong to us. They don't belong to the BLM or Joe Biden or Harris back in Washington, D.C. They belong to us. And the state of Wyoming needs to be at the forefront of fighting this battle. So I'm very proud that we got that amendment through on the floor of the House. The BLM has also come up with the brilliant idea that we're going to cover our BLM lands with solar panels. So I got an amendment through on the floor to block their Western solar plan, to try to stop them from turning all of our BLM lands into industrial sites. The other thing that's come up is the Environmental Protection Agency has come up with the brilliant idea that they need a sub-agency like the USDA. So the EPA is trying to set up a Department of Agriculture within the EPA, a separate sub-agency. Well, we already have a USDA and all the sub-agencies and the NRCS and the FSA and the Forest Service. We already have a USDA. But the EPA is trying to set up an office that would oversee all agriculture production in the United States. Well, I've been fighting with the EPA for decades. It's a very persecutorial agency. In my opinion, much of the power and authority of the EPA should be exercised by the states. We have a fabulous Department of Environmental Quality right here in Wyoming. They work very, very well with our industries. They're good at permitting. They understand the issues. They understand hydrology. They understand mining. They understand all of the things that they need to. But the EPA is trying to set up this mini USDA within that agency. And considering what the EPA does, which is scream about global warming and climate change every day of their lives and the work that they do back there, what this agency will do is it will be designed to destroy our ag industry in this country. This agency will focus solely on our emissions, whether it is in our farming, our food production that way. They will focus on our emissions with cattle and livestock production. So that is the purpose of this sub-agency, is to try to actually destroy and over-regulate our food industry, our ag industry. So I got an amendment through on the floor to defund that Office of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. Now, this bill has to go through the Senate too. And the Senate right now is controlled by the Democrats. So I'm not delusional to think that this is going to go through right away, but at least with these provisions, when there is a conference committee, these provisions are in the House passed bill right now. The other thing is that hopefully we have a different administration come November. And if we do, then we are going to be able to push several of these things through very, very quickly because we already have them ready to go. So I'm actually pretty happy with it. The other thing that the bill did, we have blocked the BLM's Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. That's also in the text of this bill. What the BLM is attempting to do is elevate what they refer to as conservation above all other uses on our BLM lands. So if you look at FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, it identifies the different uses for our federal lands, livestock grazing, mining, right-of-way, oil and gas development, et cetera, recreation, et cetera. But there's nothing in there about conservation. Well, under Tracy Stone Manning, who is the head of the BLM right now she's an eco-terrorist. She got in trouble in the 1990s for spiking trees in the National Forest Services out in the northwest part of the country. But under her, she's trying to elevate conservation above all other uses. And so they've developed a rule called the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. It violates the law. It violates FLPMA. They don't have the legal authority to do it. And some of the recent Supreme Court decisions that have come out, I think, will constrain this. But I don't think we always ought to have to be fighting that way. These agencies don't have the authority to do that. So that's the other thing that we have defunded is their ability, and not only defunded it, but to block their ability to implement that rule. We also have included in the bill is mandatory minimum oil and gas lease sales in the state. There would be a minimum of 4 every year. Right now, they're not doing any. So this is to force them to start permitting oil and gas sales again in the state of Wyoming. And finally, the bill would block the EPA's so-called Clean Power Plan 2.0. So again, from a legislative standpoint, we are fighting these things, trying to push back against them. These are probably the biggest issues that my office addresses, representing the state of Wyoming. Obviously, energy and agriculture are 2 of the more important industries that we have. And when I say energy and ag, I'm talking very broadly. I'm not thinking in a constrained way. I'm talking about all of the resource production that we do. So this is where my office really focuses its efforts. You know, a couple days ago, I was at a meeting, and we had a gentleman from Texas coming up who's an expert in the oil and gas industry, and he gave some statistics that I think are really important because I think it shows you the destruction of the Biden-Harris administration over the last 3.5 years. In 2016, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela were producing 16 million barrels of oil per day. By 2020, after President Trump ramped up our production as much as he did in just that 4-year period, by 2020, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela were down to 11.7 million barrels per day. He took out a full 1/3 of their production in 4 years by us ramping up our production. It's why energy independence is so important. You know, energy security is national security. And a weak America makes for a very dangerous world, as we've seen over the last 3.5 years. And this is one of the reasons why, because now in 2024, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela are back up to 13.5 million barrels per day. It is over $100 billion has been put into the pockets of Iran in the last 3.5 years because Biden and Harris lifted the embargo and lifted the sanctions. The Iranian leadership was on its knees, and they were most likely going to be overthrown from within. The people of Iran do not like their leadership, and they were going to overthrow them. And they now have over $100 billion that they have earned on their oil and gas sales in the last 3.5 years. That's the money they give to Hezbollah. That's the money they give to Hamas. That's the money they give to their other terrorist proxy organizations. So these policies have real world impacts on every single one of us because now we're in the middle of all these wars. We've sent $170 billion to Ukraine. The administration just announced another $20 billion for Israel. That's all your money. That's all your money. So at the same time that they're constraining our ability to exercise our rights and produce our energy and increase and improve the standard of living here, we're having to send it to other countries just trying to keep some security around the world. I did just get my first bill signed into law. It's called the Victims' Voices Act. And what it has to do with is restitution. If you're a victim of a crime, you're entitled to restitution from the person who committed that crime. But if you have to have assistance from your family members to get doctor's appointments or to go to court or any of that, they're not entitled to any kind of restitution. And for some families, this has been absolutely economically crushing in attempting to help the family members who are victims of crimes. And so what this does is, I worked with Senator John Cornyn, and it would expand the people who are entitled to restitution if they're dealing with someone who is the victim of a crime. It's just trying to make sure that we have some resources available for family members who have to help someone who has gone through this. Some of the other work that I've been doing is on July 30th, I, along with Senator Rand Paul, introduced the Standing to Challenge Government Censorship Act, which prohibits federal employees from colluding with social media to censor the protected speech of Americans. You know, what we've seen over the last couple of years has been pretty stunning to me in terms of the violation of our First Amendment rights. When you look at what happened during COVID and the lies and misinformation coming from our government, not our individuals, coming from our government, state and federal, the misinformation, and then at the same time the effort to prevent us from being able to talk about hydroxychloroquine or the origins of COVID, those things. One of the things that we've done on the Select Committee on Weaponization of the Federal Government, which I'm a part of, I'm a member of that. I was the only freshman for the first year and a half almost, is looking at the First Amendment violations from the Biden-Harris regime over the last several years. And it's stunning what we have uncovered. You know, the issue with the Hunter Biden laptop, the issue again with COVID, the issue dealing with the 2020 election, the issues surrounding the January 6th situation. So I am working with Senator Paul to make it so that we can hold federal employees personally liable if they violate our freedom of speech. Personally liable. We can get an injunction, and we can also get our attorney's fees. We should not tolerate anybody violating our First Amendment rights. And the thing that I was so surprised about, especially with COVID, it's in a time of crisis that our civil liberties are the most important. When you're not in a crisis, whether I can stand up and call somebody a name is largely irrelevant. It's when we are in a crisis that we must ensure that our federal government does not infringe upon our First Amendment rights, our Second Amendment rights, our Fourth Amendment rights, our Fifth Amendment rights. That is when we have to be, our 14th Amendment rights. That is when we must protect those the most. And yet that's when everybody cratered. And I don't know why, but I'll say this, never again. We're not doing it again. We won't tolerate it again. So I think that it's very important. And then I have a companion bill to this, and that is that it actually addresses all 5 of our First Amendment rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to petition our government for redress, freedom to peaceably assemble, and freedom of the press. And if any federal employee violates any one of those rights under my bill, you would be able to sue them, seek an injunction, and also seek attorney's fees. Because again, we're not going to tolerate this ever again. We're not going to do it. We can already sue our state people under the 14th Amendment in Section 1983. So, but we don't have that same right under the federal Constitution. So this is to fix that. On July 8th, I also introduced a bill in my role as chairman of the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs, which will require our Indian Health Service employees to receive training in the history and culture of the tribes that they serve. You know, I've been incredibly honored to be a chairman of a subcommittee as a freshman. And I have really enjoyed working on the Indian and Insular Affair issues. I oversee all 574 tribes in the nation, and then our 5 territories, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, etc. And working with the tribes, I've just learned a ton. I've learned a ton more about our tribes right here in Wyoming, the Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone. I've been incredibly honored to work with them on some of the challenges they have, their education challenges, the infrastructure challenges that they have. But I've also been able to travel around the country and meet with other tribes. And you know what? Just like everybody in this room, every tribe is different. Yet our federal government looks at them as totally monolithic. And it's one of the reasons why they do such a poor job of providing the services and addressing the needs that they have. And one of the complaints that I've heard over and over again is that there are cultural issues, there are traditions with our tribal members, even related to healthcare, even related to talking to somebody. And they feel like there are huge barriers because they go in to talk to a healthcare provider and the healthcare provider knows nothing about their culture, knows nothing about their history. So we're just going to provide yearly training to Indian Health Service employees about the tribes that they're serving. I'll give you an example of how bad it is. Our Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone, they each have their own languages. They're very proud of their languages. They're very proud of teaching their young people their languages. So the Bureau of Indian Education brought in a native speaker to help them with the teaching of their languages, but that native speaker spoke Navajo. They're like, what are we supposed to do with this? They speak Navajo, we're Arapaho and Shoshone. That's not our language. We need to be a bit more sensitive on some of those things, and I think that we can get better health outcomes for them too. So the last thing I want to talk about before we turn to questions is that we need to have accountability after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. We were all horrified by what we saw that day and shocked, and the fact is our Secret Service is failing, not only them but all of us, and there are a lot of reasons why. One is it's within the Department of Homeland Security, and Mayorkas is the head of the Department of Homeland Security. And I don't know that I've ever met more of a heinous person than Mayorkas. He has failed us on the border. He has failed us in terms of the Secret Service. He has failed us in terms of actually finding out what happened on January 6th. He's pretty much failed across the board. He's the one that I'm the most excited about getting rid of. With a new administration. But we have some additional reports coming out from the Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security, and some of those reports have just been released in the last couple of weeks. Interestingly enough, the report on what happened on January 6th that was issued by the IG Kufari, the report that came out just 10 days ago, had Mayorkas actually released that report when it was issued, which was in April, and they had followed the recommendations of that report, July 13th never would have happened. In other words, they've known for quite some time of the failures of the Secret Service that were going to result in this kind of a catastrophic outcome, and yet they did nothing about it. Instead, they just tried to bury the report. So one of the things that I've been working on is trying to force more transparency and accountability and protecting Kufari from being fired by the Department of Homeland Security. We've kind of been in a race against time because DHS and Mayorkas and the other IGs have been trying to fire the guy who's been exposing all of this, the January 6th stuff, the Secret Service stuff, and the border stuff. They've been trying to get him fired, and we've been able to block that, and I think now we've been able to permanently block it because the reports have now been released, and if they try to fire him, it will look like retaliation, and he will be able to sue them. So we were able to get that information out there. Those reports are public. They're redacted, but the reports are public if you want to look at any of them. But they describe the failures of our Secret Service and our Department of Homeland Security. I think that's information that everybody should have. So with that, I think we ought to just open it up for questions. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Jeff Hall, and my question is on the bill that you have coming forward on freedom of speech. I don't know if I'm sure you did see the other day where the Washington Post reporter was asking Jean-Pierre at the press conference, what are we going to do to, stop misinformation with Donald Trump and Elon Musk getting together and having this interview? Does that cover?
Yes, it would.
That type of thing?
Yes, it would.
And the second question is, how do we stop President Biden from forgiving student loans after the Supreme Court has said you can't do that?
So the courts keep blocking it. That is, so far the courts keep blocking it. You bring up, I'll address that issue and then I'll address the speech issue. One of the things that's been so interesting to me to watch play out over the last 3.5 years with this administration, when you think of anarchy, you think of it starting from the bottom. You think about overthrowing the government from the masses, if you will. We have a form of anarchy with the Biden-Harris regime because they refuse to follow the law. No matter what the Supreme Court or other courts pronounce, they just say, I'm going to ignore them. The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly said, you do not have the authority to forgive student loans. and they just continue to try to do it. But they keep getting blocked by other courts. So far that has been blocked. And I think that, I mean, all it is using our money to try to buy off votes. That's what it is. It's a bribery scheme. But again, it's coming from the highest positions of power in our government. It is a reprehensible thing that they are trying to do. You know, they're doing it with Medicare right now. I don't know if you read what they're trying to do with Medicare. But with some of the changes that they made to Medicare under their Part D program, or the changes they made over, I don't know if it was in their so-called Inflation Reduction Act or which one it came through. But right now, Medicare prices are poised to skyrocket.
If I'm wrong on any of this, Marty Ertman can sue me. Let her have the burden of doing that right now. If any of what I'm saying is not true, she can sue me and prove that in court. But I had been frustrated by this sort of lack of accountability when the public reacted poorly to a newspaper story about commissioner actions. She would change the story and say that that's not really how it went down. What was your? I mean, I got out of it, and then you started covering that beat. What, you know, did that frustration? Did you have that same experience leading up to the ultimate frustration of filing the secret ballot lawsuit to put a stop to that sort of thing?
100%. It's hands down the most frustrating situation I've probably ever dealt with through working at the newspaper.
But right now, Medicare prices are poised to skyrocket. And they are using general funds to cover those costs until after the November election. So we're in a terrible, terrible situation. I know there are people in here on Medicare and Social Security.
Oh, yeah.
And those prices are going to skyrocket right now if the courts were to block what they're trying to do. Because what they did is they raided the system. In terms of trying to pay for other things. And their Part D program is failing. They know it's failing. And so I don't know what they're going to do, but they're doing the same thing with that as they've done with student loans, is they're using general funds and tax receipts to try to cover this up. So again, we have a terrible, terrible administration in place right now. Then getting to the First Amendment issue, we've had Michael Schellenberger, Matt Taibbi, Professor Jonathan Turley. We've had a variety of First Amendment experts come and testify before the Select Committee on Weaponization. And what this administration has done is they've come up with 3 categories: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Do you know how they define malinformation? Information that may be true, but it's inconvenient. They defined it. That's not my definition. They defined it. And you know what that was? That was the information about whether hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin could actually be used to treat COVID. The other thing that they declared as malinformation is that that the virus came from China, that it came from a Chinese lab. That's what they're doing. They're literally redefining words, just like you would see in some Kafkaesque book from the 1930s. It's pretty crazy, but that's what Rand Paul and I are both trying to get at, is to prevent them from being able to do that. Other questions? Right here, and then I'll come to you.
One of the biggest things that scares me is this CBDC business.
Yes.
Now I hear there's even Republicans getting behind it in Congress.
Well, they better not.
Have you heard anything to that?
I have not heard any Republican that supports that. So he's talking about central bank digital currency. And we know what happened in Canada. We say where it's happening elsewhere. I mean, look at what is going on in Great Britain right now. Look at what is going on right now in Great Britain. There was a guy who was arrested, what was it, on August 8th, and he's already been convicted and sentenced to 18 months because he made a negative reference to Allah. I mean, this is crazy stuff, and the way that they can control you is with the CBDC. So I am not heard of any Republicans who are supporting that. It would have to go through Congress. We will fight that tooth and nail and do everything that we can to expose it, because that is a very dangerous road to go down, where you allow the government to control all aspects of financial transactions, which is exactly what that would do. So we have to fight that. That's a very legitimate concern. We need to be more decentralizing rather than centralizing, which is what that would do. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Ron Thorson. Most of us know about the Supreme Court overturning the Chevron deference. The result of this has been that the agencies should have to stop legislating and making rules. Do you foresee Congress taking over and making rules for everything that they enact, which now they just turn it over to the agency and say, you make the rules, we'll back you up? Well, they can't do that anymore.
Well, so what I describe it as legislative malpractice. For decades, Congress has abdicated its responsibility of legislating. And they've put together vague or broad brush strokes of Obamacare was an example. Obamacare was over 2,000 pages long, and there were over 20,000 pages of regulations associated with it, including 18 pages of how to treat bee stings. So it is absurd what has happened in our form of government. It's probably the biggest priority that I have in the long run is fundamental regulatory or administrative law reform. The Chevron decision was a very important decision. By the way, that was my law firm that won that case. So I'm very proud of that. It was the NCLA, the New Civil Liberties Alliance out of Washington, D.C., was one of the lead counsel on that. But what the courts did, and I don't know if you saw what happened yesterday, but a 3-panel court from the Circuit Court of Appeals, the most liberal court of appeals in the United States, maybe the Ninth Circuit. They kind of fight for the title on that one. They blocked a regulation yesterday saying that they did not have to defer to the interpretation of the agency, or whether it was reasonable or not, that what the law said was X, Y, and Z, and that's the law that they were going to enforce. So relying upon Chevron, a 3-judge panel in the Circuit Court of Appeals is already paring back agency authority and agency interpretation of statutes. So one of the things that I've done is that Steve Scalise has kind of tapped me to help with working on regulatory reform through reconciliation. So we've got some ideas of things that we're going to do. And what reconciliation means is that we don't have to have 60 votes in the Senate. We can do it by 50 votes, but there are certain rules you have to meet on that legislation. So I'm going to be working on the regulatory side of that. The other thing is that the source of the power of these administrative agencies is what's called the Administrative Procedure Act. It was passed in 1946, and the purpose of it was to provide uniformity in rulemaking. And it's never been amended in the intervening 80 years. But that's the source of the power for these agencies. And I think that if we're gonna go at this, we don't just go agency by agency. We don't just go at the EPA or the BLM or the Forest Service. We need to cut off the head of the snake. And so I'm working on fundamental, and it's not gonna be done fast. We're working on it. We've been working on it for a long time. It's going to be a bigger package so that when we get a new administration, we're ready to go. But I want Congress to retake its authority of legislating, not only because that's what the Constitution says, but it's the only way you can hold us accountable. I get awfully tired of people who come back to their states or their districts and say, oh, those doggone agencies, they did X, Y, and Z. It's the agencies that are out of control. Well, then fix it. You're the legislator, fix it. And that's what I want to do. So that's where I think that we're headed. But yes, I think that the decision out of the Supreme Court, but there's like 6 decisions that have come out of the Supreme Court that all taken together are really constraining what these agencies can do. The Cargill case that said that the ATF does not have the legal authority to declare a bump stock to be a machine gun. The case, the West Virginia case, that said that the EPA did not have the authority under the Clean Air Act to do what they were doing to their coal mining back there. The water decision that came out earlier this year, the Sackett decision, that said that the EPA cannot declare a mud puddle to be a navigable water of the United States. So the U.S. Supremes are working really hard to actually get these things back constrained, and I think that's a really good thing. And right here.
Yes, Bob Harshbarger, federal lands permittee on the national grasslands. Last Monday, we had our annual meeting up in Bowman Association of National Grasslands, which you attended a couple times for us. On the schedule, there was 4 or 5 people scheduled from the Forest Service to be in attendance. How many showed up? Primary people that were supposed to show up did not show up.
0.
0. There was, I'll take that back, there was one lady out of North Dakota, out of newly appointed forest supervisor or something like that, with very few words of wisdom. She didn't know her business. And so my big gripe is we had about 40 permittees there throughout North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, 3 of us from Wyoming, and Nebraska. About 40 people there. The Forest Service in its management of the national grasslands is atrocious,
It is atrocious.
and it needs to be changed. And I would like to, in your busy full plate that you are taking on, let's take the
Okay.
national grasslands out from under the supervision of the Forest Service. They're not doing their job. They're killing us.
They're killing us. Carly, would we get back, let's visit with James and Troy and see what it is that we can do? Perhaps we could get out here, take a tour, or have them get out here and take a tour, see what we could do legislatively to force some fixes with that. I know that the prairie dogs, their failure to manage the prairie dogs and other things have really devastated our national grasslands. We need to do something different. But this is why when you have these big, huge land management agencies, they fail in a lot of ways. And our catastrophic forest fires, you know, I've had the opportunity over the last 10 days to talk to 2 men who work for the Forest Service and on the western side of the state. So they don't deal with our national grasslands, but they deal with our national forests over there. And I asked both of them point blank, is what's coming out of Washington, D.C., does it make it difficult, if not impossible, for you to do your job? And they said, absolutely. We know how to manage our national forests. What it comes out of Washington, D.C. with the rules and regulations are what's killing us. And that's what I'm trying to get at. I guess that way's east. Washington, D.C. is broken, and we need to have more of the power, control, and authority right here that's closer to home.
Yes, ma'am. But the big point, the national grasslands are a separate entity from the BLM
Yes, they are.
and from the Forest Service. And the other thing, I still got their law enforcement that happened over to South Dakota.
Horrible.
To the Maud family.
Mhm.
I just talked to Sheriff Colby here, and the law enforcement in Weston County is our sheriff. The FBI, the Forest Service, none of them can come in and enforce what has happened in South Dakota. This has to change. The Forest Service, as far as the national grasslands and the grazing permittees on the national grasslands, must be held separate. They were developed separately in the 1930s when these lands were appropriated and set aside for grassland agriculture. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm well aware of the mod situation in South Dakota, and my nephew Lane Hageman from down by Fort Laramie sent me the information. He's been in contact with them. I immediately got into contact with Dusty Johnson, who is the representative from South Dakota. It is my understanding that his office is working to address that situation. And I will give him any support or that I can provide that he needs from me.
That's correct.
But this is on our radar, and we are trying to address this right now.
It is going to happen to me. It definitely is, because I'm such a thorn in their side.
You know, it's weird how our federal agencies have become very militarized. this was a different circumstance with a catastrophic and a different outcome, but we had a hearing a couple of months ago with the situation with the head of the airport in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he was a gun collector, and he built guns, and totally innocent situation. But he had some paperwork violations, and the paperwork for the ATF is very difficult to understand. So he had not filled out the paperwork correctly. The ATF came to his house at 1 o'clock in the morning, put duct tape across his Ring camera, cut off the electricity to his house and put a block so that there was no internet, used a battering ram, knocked down the door at 1 o'clock in the morning. He came running downstairs with a gun. He did a warning shot. He shot into the floor. It ricocheted, hit one of the officers in the foot, and they shot him in the head and killed him. And my point to the ATF guy was, you guys were executing a search warrant, you ended up executing him. And it is a terrible, terrible situation of what they have done. It's unacceptable, and we've got to rein in that power. We've got to stop this kind of stuff. It is really dangerous. I think there was another question back here, right over here.
Yeah, Harriet, thanks for all you do, but I was listening to one of my favorite sources of malinformation this morning on the way into town, and they were interviewing the Montana Attorney General there, and there's 8 states, I don't know if Wyoming's included, that are suing Sleepy Joe for this executive order on trying to federalize the voting system. That's one thing that's worried me more than anything, that Democrats have been cheating ever since Kennedy beat Nixon, and they're getting more brazen about it all the time. But do you know anything about that executive order?
I'm not sure Wyoming is a party to that, but they should be.
Well, Governor Nuttoast needs to get busy on that.
I'm not sure that they are, and one of the reasons why I think Wyoming needs to be a party to more lawsuits is if they are not a party, but they ultimately get an injunction, the injunction only applies in the states that fight the battle. So Title IX is an example, with the rewriting of Title IX by this administration. But Wyoming is a party to one of those lawsuits. Wyoming is a party to one of the Title IX lawsuits. I believe that Wyoming will be a party when they have to sue over the Rock Springs RMP or the Buffalo RMP. They need to be the lead on those 2 situations. Wyoming needs to be. But I really do, and I know I'm an attorney. When you're a hammer, everything's a nail, right? I get that, but this is where a lot of these battles are fought. And Wyoming needs to engage in these battles. For one thing, courts pay attention when states are involved. States have rights. They recognize our rights. And the more states that you have challenging these types of things, the better off that we are. So I don't think that Wyoming is a party to that, but I did see that there are states trying to stop them from doing what it is that they're doing with that. One other thing I'll say about it is that people kind of wonder why they have had the open border that they've had. There's a lot of reasons. But one of them is redistricting is done based upon population, not on citizenship. So the 2020 census, California and New York had both lost population, and Texas and Florida gained. And as a result, California and New York lost representatives in Congress. They want them back. That's why it doesn't necessarily bother them. They don't like it. It's annoying, and they'll whine and complain about it. New York City has spent over $5 billion on illegals in the last 3.5 years. But if these numbers stay, if they stick, they may very well in the 2030 census be able to get those representatives back. So I am the co-sponsor on a bill with Chip Roy. 1, it absolutely prohibits illegals from voting, which is already illegal. Number 2, it requires proof of citizenship. When you vote, it would require proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections, not state elections, but in federal elections. And then the other thing it does is it says for census purposes, for redistricting purposes, only citizens can be counted. And so it would take away a lot of the incentive that the Dems have had in terms of allowing the overrun of the southern border. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, Stanley Jasinski. Thank you, Representative Hageman. You actually addressed a lot of the issues.
Good.
But I wanted to go back to 2 of the things you said, where our legislators, particularly Washington, abandoned the American people, and one was started with the George Floyd riots that started in Minneapolis and spread throughout our country, creating billions of dollars, and all we could do is watch why our legislators let our country burn to the ground, and follow that up with the virus, the Wuhan virus, where for months the legislators, the leaders of this country completely disappeared. And we as American people were out there being rounded up, herded up, told what we could eat, where we could stand, what we could breathe, wear masks, and nobody was guiding us. So who just announced 2 days ago that we have the new emergency?
monkeypox.
Monkeypox. Well, you can't say monkey.
You can't say
gotta
monkeypox.
mpox.
Mpox, that's the way that they're.
Right, and we all already know they've been trying to get this global treaty, so that who.
That failed.
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay.
But so my point is, and this circles back to, you said that the legislators would never let that happen again. In other words, abandoning us like they did.
I don't know if our legislators wouldn't let it happen again, but I don't think we should.
Well.
I don't think the citizens
American
should.
people?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, don't comply, I understand.
Yeah, you tell me to put on a mask to go in a grocery store? No.
Yeah, okay.
No.
But we also need backup from our legislators.
I know that.
Okay, so one of the reasons why they want to do this, obviously, is massive mail-in ballots, which is what came out of it. Where do you stand on mail-in ballots and hand-counted one-day voting?
Well, I'd love to see one-day voting. And the longer the voting goes on, the more cheating that is going to happen. The hand counting. So let me say, there are a lot of things that have happened since 2020 in the space of election integrity. And in part because the RNC, the Republican National Committee, has actually really stepped up and is working extremely hard because of people like me complaining. So because when I was running for office, and then as I've done my town halls over the last year and a half, election integrity is at the forefront of everyone's mind, and it should be, So when I first went back to DC, I made an appointment and I went and met with the election integrity team of the RNC and spent several hours. And I had a stack of articles of all the different things that I had read and heard about and learned about of what happened during the 2020 election. And we went through them and I said, okay, in Wisconsin this happened, what are you doing to stop that? In Minnesota, this happened. What are you doing to stop that? In New Mexico, they're doing this. What are you doing to stop that? And we spent a ton of time going through that. And then I did that again about 2 months ago to see what kind of progress they've made in the last year and a half, because I know people want to know about it. They've made huge progress, in some ways changing the laws in the states. Wisconsin, for example, has now made it illegal for private funding to come into our county clerk's offices, the Zuckerberg money. The $500 million get out the Democrat vote. A lot of states have made that illegal. Not in Wyoming, but we should. In Wyoming, there has been a bill to make it illegal for our county clerks or our state to take private funds. It hasn't passed yet. It needs to. Wyoming needs to stop that here just as well as they've done it in other places. Pennsylvania has had some good lawsuits and some good decisions that have come out of how they were counting, as well as signature verification. Georgia has fundamentally changed their election laws so that they've got a lot of the deadwood off the books, and they have more constraints on what they can do for voting. There are also, the RNC has over almost 160,000 volunteers to engage with the election process once early voting starts in September. So what I'm telling you is that the landscape is very different than it was 4 years ago, because the RNC has finally recognized that this is the key. We count votes, the Democrats count ballots. And there's a difference. They're not the same thing. We want them to be the same, but that's where the cheating comes in. So what I can tell you is that there has been a yeoman's effort to try to address a lot of these issues. Have they resolved all of them? Probably not, but they've resolved a lot of them. But our states are where the elections should be controlled, not federal. We do not want to federalize our elections. And so what I would say is that you need to be putting pressure on our own legislators and on our governor to pass good election integrity laws, so that, and don't listen to the nonsense that it doesn't happen here. It didn't happen in Wisconsin until it did. right? I mean, you gotta be proactive on something like this. And we know the Zuckerberg money, we know that altered the outcome of the 2020 election. $500 million, in addition to which it was unconstitutional agency capture. He had no legal authority to take control of public entities in order to pursue his own political agenda, but he did. So we've got to stop those kinds of things in Wyoming and elsewhere. But I really do believe that our states have stepped up and our courts have stepped up over the last 3.5 years in much better ways.
Proof of citizenship to vote?
That's the bill that we're running right now. That's the bill that Chip Roy out of Texas and I are running right now. Proof of citizenship to vote is a very important one.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
My name is Bob Felke, and I want to apologize to everybody. I moved up here from Colorado about 4 years ago. One of the first things I got to do was help throw Liz Cheney out. Thrilled me to death. I'm having a hard time because everybody knows everybody in this town. I know nobody. So I'm having a real hard time. To me, there's almost three parties. There's the Democrats, there's the establishment Republicans, and then there's the Freedom Republicans. So I'm having a hard time with all the political ads and stuff. You know, there's so much malinformation, whatever you want to call it. Bullshit is what I call it. Is it true that Governor Gordon kicked a guy off the some medical board because he was trying to protect kids from
Yes.
this transgender?
Yes.
See, I need help. You know, I want to vote for the right people, but you know, when you don't come from here.
What happened was Dr. Cuban had provided information to the
Right.
legislature about the consequences of doing this kind of medical treatment on minors.
Right.
And he was on the state medical board, and Governor Gordon concluded that he then had a conflict of interest and removed him.
Okay, well, that's, if maybe I can meet with you a minute afterwards, because there's only, 3 or 4 of the primary votes that I have an opportunity.
What I want you to do is you need to go and look at their voting record to the extent that you can. And since you're here and you've got other people here, introduce yourself to some of these folks. Look at the voting record of these people. That's the best advice that I have. Now, Governor Gordon, you're not going to have that as the voting record. You're not going to be able to see that, but he's not on the ballot this time anyway.
Right.
And I'm not trying to take a side in this. I'm just telling you that's what he did, and I disagree with it. Other people may agree with it. You know,
I just want to throw my primary vote at the right people.
you need to look at the voting record, and we can visit. But I appreciate you coming here. We want people coming to Wyoming with good politics.
Well, I was born and raised in Colorado. I love this state, and it just went so far down the toilet that where am I going to go? I'm coming to Wyoming.
Yeah. So one of the things that we had, especially, I referred to them. After COVID, I refer to them as refugees from lockdown states.
Right.
We got a ton of refugees coming into Wyoming from Oregon and Washington, where seem to be the people that I meet most across the state. That came here from Oregon and Washington, and I was in Cody for the Independence Day celebration. And the number of people who were there kind of scares me. That's why property prices are going up. But the number of people who came over and talked to me and said, we are here looking at property because we have to get out of Washington. We have to get out of Colorado. We have to get out of Oregon. We're bringing them here, but we want people who are liberty and freedom minded.
Amen.
We want people who are going to fight the battles that are important to Wyoming. So thank you. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that I get to represent you. And I know there's a question right back here.
We just have time for one more question after this.
Well, to follow up on his, maybe you could speak to, we're seeing a lot of the mailers and stuff brought in by the Americans for Prosperity, who Koch brothers funded their rabid anti-Trump, funded Cheney even after she was on the select January 6th committee and stuff like that. A lot of disinformation stuff and attacking people that are on the Freedom Caucus and stuff like that. Maybe you could speak to those two things.
Well, I just added up very quickly yesterday, and it's not an official number, but in the Cowboy State Daily article yesterday, this is the first time in Wyoming history we've seen this, but I just added up the numbers that were reported in that Cowboy State Daily article. These are not entirely accurate. Let's just say this is the ballpark. There's about $3 million has come into Wyoming in the legislative races. I've never seen that before. I have never, ever, ever in my entire life in Wyoming, and being pretty active in politics, even with my father as a child, I've never seen $3 million spent. And a lot of it is coming from outside groups. And I think Senator Sherry Steinmetz says it the best, which is we have what they want. We've got people coming into our state and they're looking at Wyoming and recognizing for a pretty small amount of money, they can get people elected who really do believe in things like global warming and climate change and are willing to destroy our primary industries to go after it. So you've got outsiders who are messing in our election because they want to control what happens here. And we have to understand, being one of the largest energy producers in the nation, we've got the largest coal reserves. Trona is not energy, but we are one of the largest trona producers in the world. Our primary competition is China and Kazakhstan. We're the 8th largest oil and gas producer in the nation. We could be higher than that. We've got the uranium. We just saw this week we're starting to produce uranium again in the state of Wyoming, and we've got the facility right out here, not far from here, northwest of here. What I'm going to say is what I said before, which is you need to go look at the voting record, but you also you talk to friends, talk to neighbors, understand who's voting which way. And there's no secret that I'm a conservative. There's no secret that I'm a conservative in where I land. And I think that you'll find that there are good conservatives who are running.
Thanks for everything you're doing.
Thank you. Question over here.
Yeah, so Caleb Carter with the Weston County Natural Resource District. I just wanted to piggyback on some of the concerns with BLM and Forest Service that you expressed earlier and that others shared. So we're a local conservation district here, so we act as a cooperating agency, and we're very lucky in Wyoming to have state statute that gives us that responsibility.
Yes.
And gives us the teeth to be able to come back to these agencies and say, hey, we need a seat at the table. Some of our neighboring states, conservation districts, don't have that luxury, and sometimes they're trying to piggyback on our efforts and our pushback to get in on these opportunities. But what we're seeing is shift in a lot of these federal agency policies, so that they're shifting from the traditional planning process. They're going into plan amendments, such as the Old Growth Forest Plan Amendment that's ongoing right now. They're creating rules, which I know you're familiar with because you've been helping us fight several of these, such as the BLM lands rule and stuff. And so my concern is we're starting to see a reinterpretation of NEPA, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but I know you are, but is the National Environmental Policy Act, which gives us, through the 2012 planning rule, the ability and authority to have cooperating agency status. But my concern is we're seeing a reinterpretation of those rules, and we're seeing ways that these entities, federal agencies, are going around that and trying to avoid these cooperating agency statuses. They're trying to put tribes over local governments. Yep. And again, I want to have on the record, I have nothing against the tribes having a say in these things. Everybody should have a say.
Everybody should.
But we should all be on equal footing, right? We should all be working together. And so my concern is...
By the way, that specific issue came from an executive order issued by Biden very early in his presidency. Yes. So it is an effort to elevate one group of people above another based on an executive order rather than a law.
Yeah. So my concern is, I guess, that we might have to elevate some of these issues and really look at, what's going on here with some of these reinterpretations and some of these avoidance of this cooperating agency opportunity, where it allows the states and others to be cooperating agencies, represent all of you that are sitting here in these planning processes.
So as a private attorney, I worked with the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts many, many times. This is a business model that I think is highly successful and been very successful for the state of Wyoming. So I'm going to ask you to do something to help me. Mm-hmm. First of all, I agree with you that they are circumventing the law by creating different standards and different definitions and things like that. This is something that I know some about, but I don't know what you know. Mm-hmm. And I want two things. One, I want you to be working with my office when you identify these challenges. But number two, what I'd really like you to do is I'd like you to sit down with my office and help to draft a letter to whatever agency or agencies we need to identify what they are doing in an effort to circumvent NEPA and the other requirements in cooperating agency status and things like that, so that I can send that to these agencies and say, this has been brought to my attention. We can either ask questions if that's what you would like to have, or we can say, we want a commitment from you that you will actually comply with the law. And if you don't, then we need to come to states like Wyoming, and we need to start filing lawsuits against their efforts to circumvent the law.
Yep.
So I'm going to give you a homework assignment,
Great.
and that is, I don't know all the terminology, and if you will help us, if you will be a volunteer staffer for a short period of time to help me to draft whatever it is that we need to expose this and to hold them to task and accountable, I'm happy to work with you.
Yeah.
Will you do that for us?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I'm here for.
Then what I want you
Yeah.
also to do is I want you to talk to your cohorts in other counties to identify what issues they may have that you may not have right here.
Yeah.
And see if we can get an all-encompassing, comprehensive letter that we can be sending to these agencies, or agencies, to try to get to the bottom of this and put them kind of on their back heels a bit.
Yep.
Then the other thing that I can do is we can also draft legislation. If we come up with something that we believe needs to be fixed to constrain their power to do what they're doing, then we can draft a bill and we can run it. So again, there's solutions to this, but I need you to bring them to me. I need you to help me. Okay? If you'll help me, we can try to fix it.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, thank you.
You too, yes. Work with that gentleman, come up with what you think needs to be done with the grasslands, and let's see if we can include that in the letter, okay? Okay, he just got a huge assignment, didn't he? Well, thank you, really, thank you all. Being interested in what's going on, we are going to take our country back. We are going to take our country back. You know, throughout history, it's always been a very small number of people throughout history who changed the course of history, right? We have a constitution, we have the resilience, we have the foundation, and Wyoming is the last best hope. We have to do it here. If we do it here, we can get it done elsewhere. People pay a lot of attention to what happens in Wyoming. But we need to fight these battles and be willing to expose people when they do bad things too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In addition to the weekly printed version of the newsletter journal, we also promote our community and share important information on our award-winning website, newslj.com, and in our weekly email newsletter, Nuke Now. We also connect with readers through various social media platforms and invite you to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can even take a look at a recent meeting of the City Council, School Board, or County Commission on our YouTube channel. We do hope that you will go to newslj.com and subscribe today, and we look forward to making all of our great content available to you. But regardless of your level of support, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for doing your part to preserve a free and independent local press.